on today's Story Beat.
Once upon a time on this planet, men and women were walking along, dragging their knuckles along the ground as cavemen and cavewomen. And then one day they suddenly picked themselves up off the ground and realized they wanted to communicate. And they figured a way of drawing on their cave walls with daub and wattle and whatever else. And the beauty is that what they created was comic strips. That's the first comic strip. And the real beauty is that those comic strips are still communicating with us today, thousands and thousands and thousands of years later. And we are being told stories by the cavemen, our ancestors.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on Story Beat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, the writer, editor, artist, and manager, Tim Quinn, was born in Liverpool, England. He started his career as a clown at Blackpool Tower Circus before working on BBC TV's Good Old Days music hall series, where he wrote scripts for top comedians. It was a small jump from there into the world of comic books, where he spent many happy years as a scriptwriter on such noted UK titles as The Beano, The Dandy, Sparky, The Topper, Buster, Whoopee, Bunty, Jackie, Doctor Who magazine, and Whizzer and Chips, before heading to the United States to work for the mighty Marvel Comics Group as both editor and head of special projects. Through those years, he also produced many daily newspaper comic strips and interviews with such names as Klaus Voormann, Derek Taylor, Sir Tim Rice, Jeffrey Archer, Willy Russell, Eddie Izzard, Sierra Boggess, and Chyler Leigh. Tim has worked as a writer for the Guardian newspaper, as well as editor for America's oldest publication, the Saturday Evening Post, and as producer for LWT's The South Bank Show TV documentary series that included, among others, a show on the history of Marvel Comics. For many years, Tim ran a publishing company with his wife Jane and Gillian Baverstock, the elder daughter of noted children's author Enid Blyton. Additionally, Tim and Jane ran Mighty Quinn Management as agents and managers to many musicians while putting on huge charity shows featuring members of Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones. These days, Tim's the editor-in-chief for the Merseyside charity Liverpool Heartbeat, creating literacy-based comic books for schools across the region. He's also produced books for New Haven Publishing, who just released The Jolly Bloodbath, a piratical novel for children written by the brothers Quinn, Tim and his younger brother, Jason, who's a well-known comic book writer. Tim will soon publish his autobiography, Arg, also from New Haven Publishing. I've read both The Jolly Bloodbath and Arg, and can tell you Tim's writing is highly imaginative, fantastically energetic, and brilliantly hilarious. I highly recommend both books to you. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my great privilege to be able to spend some time today chatting with the extraordinarily multi-talented writer, editor, and manager, Tim Quinn. Tim, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Hello, Pittsburgh. It's my first time in the city. How lovely to be there.
Well, it's lovely to have you, trust me. So let's go back in time just a little bit into some of your autobiography. And at what age did you first start thinking to yourself, I think I really like this storytelling thing, and maybe I want to write stories? When did you first start thinking that way?
My very earliest memory is actually doing that. I'm 2 3/4 years of age. The time is 1956, and we've just moved into a big house in Liverpool, my parents and my brother and I, and I'm getting under my mother's feet as she carries stuff in from the removal van, and she sticks a piece of charcoal in my hand and tells me to go and draw on my bedroom wall. And I will say this, for any budding artists out there or storytellers, it's the best way to learn to tell stories by drawing on your bedroom wall. So any kids out there, Tell them that this guy from Marvel Comics has just told you you can go and draw on your bedroom wall.
Many parents will be very happy.
They will be delighted. I know. Well, the luck was with me though, because I remember my mother saying, "Draw something you like," and I thought, well, I know what I like. I like eggs, hard-boiled eggs. So I attempted to draw a hard-boiled egg on, It's weird when you're 2 3/4. You think in ways unlike anybody else in the universe.
Sure.
And luckily, it ended up looking like a hard-boiled egg, and I was very happy with it. So happy that I thought, well, I'd like to tell a story about it. So I thought I'd better put a face on it, and I put a face on it. And then, having put the face on it, I did what every 2 3/4-year-old does. I thought scribble will really add something to this picture. So I started scribbling on it, and bizarrely, the scribble turned this egg thing into a hedgehog. And my brother, who was 5 years older than me, walked into the room at that time, and he said, "How do you know how to draw a hedgehog?" Well, of course, I hadn't a clue how to draw a hedgehog, but by luck, I'd found how to do it. And I suddenly realized that I now had a character that I could tell stories about. So I guess I was already being told stories. My parents were very literate, huge readers. My brother was too. He was a 7-year-old by that time. And he was already reading comics and bringing those home every week. Because here in Britain, we had weekly comics. And so you would follow all these adventures. And most of the comic books in Britain at that time were full of stories that would last a page in length. So there'd be a variety of tales. So on page 1, it might be a story about a funny little bear. On page 2, it'd be about a time-traveling boy who can travel through time. On page 3, it'll be a story about a knight in shining armor. On page 4, will be in the Wild West, and so on. Mm-hmm. So you get all this huge variety of stories, and all done by different artists. And all of the artists were real class acts. They could draw a kitchen table and make it look interesting. So it was amazing work that bombarded me in those early years, even before I could read.
But you said something interesting that you were drawing, and your brother comes in and says, "How did you know how to draw a hedgehog?" And you didn't know how to draw a hedgehog, but you were being creative in your own way, not even knowing that's what was happening. And that, I think, is the essence of what creativity actually is. Just exploring things and not knowing what you're doing in order to go find something.
Well, absolutely. I mean, for the last 30 years, I've been going into schools to show kids how easy it is to write and draw. This is not brain surgery. This is not rocket science. This is something that we all have the ability to do. But sadly, often it's knocked out of us at school because the education system is so bloody dire. And so I show them, I'm usually in each classroom for about a couple of hours, and I show them a few tricks, how to do it, how to create characters, how to tell stories, where to pull ideas from, and so on. And you see lights going on in eyes. It's a very easy thing to teach. And it's very rewarding to see these lights go on in eyes, because I'm a great believer in the fact that when you leave school, you only need one thing when you leave school. You don't need tons of qualifications and all that garbage. You need to believe in yourself. Once you believe in yourself, well, the world is your oyster. Doesn't mean everything's going to work, because as anybody who works in the arts will tell you, it is a life of ups and downs, just as life is a life of ups and downs. Certainly a career in the arts is guaranteed ups and downs.
Lots of mistakes will be made.
Yeah, quite. But I mean, I look back, I'm often asked, what's the favorite thing you worked on? And it's probably stuff that I've got on a shelf here in my office that didn't actually make it out to the public. But I don't care, really. We did it. We produced it. We created it. So for whatever reason that the publisher might have had cold feet at the end, or thought, well, that's not Harry Potter, is it? Or that's not whatever's big at the moment. That doesn't faze me anymore. I don't care if I see my name on books, on shelves, or whatever. I guess these days I've got back to the joy of just creating for the joy of it, for the love of it, which is something that I think every kid has. certainly before they go to school, when they find the magic that is in a pencil and a piece of paper.
So when you were doing that at 2.5, 3 years old, did your parents recognize that in you? And did they send you off to be trained in any way?
No, thank God. They didn't send me off anywhere. They were quite happy to have me in the house. No, but my mother was an artist. And in fact, she joined me in my main memory of her now, thinking back, is of this extraordinary woman drawing in charcoal on the walls of this beautiful old Victorian house that we lived in. And her excuse was, well, we're going to redecorate anyway. And we did redecorate about 10 years later, by which time all the walls were covered with these fabulous illustrations of my mother's, which were usually pictures of witches and elves and goblins and pixies, fairy folk, which were great for the imagination of a kid growing up, at that time. So Mum was a little wacky, to say the least.
So as a kid, well, that's wonderful, because you then had an inspiration and someone that was not telling you, no, don't draw on the walls, it's going to make the walls dirty. No, she was encouraging you to do just the opposite, which is to be creative in some way. That I think is very helpful.
As was my brother, my elder brother, Mike, because my memory of those days, we shared a bedroom. And every night when we were lying in bed, we would start telling each other stories. And that's certainly from my earliest memory. So being 2 3/4 years of age onwards, we would tell stories. And I take this opportunity to say that the film rights for many of those stories are still available. And there were stories about bizarre characters like Mr. Potato and Mr. Carrot, who lived in a key park that was opposite our house. It
sounds to me like Mr. Potato and Mr. Carrot should get into a stew.
They should indeed. I don't think we went that route, but thank you for the idea. Next time I'm sleeping in a bedroom with my brother alongside me, I shall bring that point up, and we'll see where we go with this. We sure as heck will not be taking the credit for that line.
I'll have my people contact your people.
Yes, indeed, quite.
So, all right, at some point as you're growing up, you make a decision that many kids think about, but you actually act upon. You go off and join a circus as a teenager. Now, lots of kids think, I want to join the circus. That looks like fun. But you did it. So how did you manage to escape like that and to go off and join a circus?
Well, it all goes back to my school and my schooling. And my schooling was an incredibly academic school, a very Victorian school. Victorian going on medieval in many ways. Our textbooks at the school were actually from the 1890s.
Wow.
And this was the 1950s and the 1960s, at least 1960s, that I was there. And it was run by a bunch of characters called the Irish Christian Brothers. Alarm bells should be ringing in anybody's front room when they hear this. They were dedicated to knocking any creativity out of young children. They were the most ghastly bunch, who really should not have been anywhere near any child. But I will say this for them. I learned to deal with very difficult people when I was 8 years of age in their charge. And that came in help. Well, that was so helpful when I found myself working for such publishers as Robert Maxwell and I've forgotten his name now.
Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch, thank you. And another delightful chap called Richard Desmond, who ran a publishing company, of whom I do talk a little in my autobiography. And these are people who like the people under them to walk in fear. And indeed, the people under them do walk in fear. Publishing is a strange game. These guys are very much like James Bond villains. All that's missing is the white pussycat on their lap. Very strange people who will sit at their boardroom table trying to intimidate. But they couldn't do that with me because at age 8, I'd been under the thumb of the Irish Christian Brothers and figured out ways to, get around working with these complete bizarre people. So I do thank them for that. And indeed, now I guess I'm of an age now where I look back almost fondly on them, in that, you know what, they were real characters.
Well, you clearly learned something from them because it's held you in good stead all these years, some kind of discipline, some kind of rejection of authority, which has held you in good stead in some way. Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I learned not to have a religion, that's for sure, because they were 100% Catholic, old school Catholicism. So the idea with that school was to either become a bank manager or a priest. By the time I left school, it was the day I turned 16. So that's when I was released from imprisonment at the school. And I remember racing out of the gates. And at this time, it's the end of the 60s. And but I've got a 60s sensibility about me. And you do things on a whim. Now, I knew that I wanted to work in comics, but I had no idea how to get in there. I knew I had to get a job because that's the kind of family I come from. And I remembered the words of one of my teachers who would say repeatedly to me, you know what you are, Quinn? You're a clown. You're a clown. What are you? And I had to repeat, I'm a clown, sir. I'm a clown. Yes, go and sit down. And I suddenly thought, you know what? There's a circus up coast from Liverpool in a little resort called Blackpool, very famous place over here. So I got on a coach the day after leaving school and went up to Blackpool. First time I'd been there. And I got off the coach, saw the Blackpool Tower, very famous piece of ironmongery in the middle of the town, and made my way there because I knew the circus was underneath it. Found the stage door, knocked on it, and you have to keep in mind, I looked like a disheveled scruff from Liverpool because that's what I was at that point. 16 years of age, clueless Catholic schoolboy, and the door was opened by the most famous person I'd ever met at that point. And that's simply because I hadn't met any famous people by that time. But he was very, very famous in Great Britain. His name was Charlie Caroli, and he'd been a clown at this circus for 40 years. And he was in full makeup, and he opened the door and he said, what do you want? And I said, are there any jobs going? And he stood back and looked me up and down, and he said, follow me. And he took me across the deserted circus ring to his dressing room, sat me in a chair, and in front of me were these 100-watt bulbs round a mirror. And I thought, well, this is showbiz, man. This is great. And he suddenly put white slop on my face, found a wig, put it on my head. And then he instructed me, right, you're going to run into the ring. You're going to carry these buckets of water. You're going to throw them at me and the other clowns. And you're going to miss. Do you understand what I mean when I say miss? I said, I can do that. So a day after leaving Catholic school, I was running into the circus ring with 10,000 people or so, it seemed, cheering and shouting and laughing at us. And I was throwing buckets of water at the clowns and very proud of myself because I did miss them. And then I stood there rooted to the spot in the middle of the ring because I didn't know what to do next. And luckily, the main clown, Charlie, saw my plight. He ran over to me, pulled my trousers down to my ankles, grabbed hold of my underpants and pulled them out and poured a bucket of freezing cold water in. The crowd went crazy. This was the funniest thing they had ever seen. And I remember standing there at that moment. And up until that moment, I'd been a fairly typical, self-conscious, 16-year-old schoolboy. And everything changed there because I remember thinking, well, I will never be self-conscious ever again in my life. After this, as I traipsed off out of the ring with wringing wet underpants and a sort of exhilaration at having been in front of an audience, which was sheer joy. It was as if somebody had put one of those things that they do in hospitals where, you know, if they've just lost you, so they'll put these things on your heart and go boof, to boof you back into life. I forget what they're called, but defibrillators.
The defibrillator, yes.
That's it, yeah. It was as if I'd just had that to wake me up from the last 3 years of schooling, where basically I'd sat at the back of the class, daydreaming.
And you were how old at this moment?
I just turned 16, and a very young 16 going on about 8.
And suddenly you're in show business.
I'm in showbiz, man. Yes, it is. I even had my own dressing room, which was great. And in my own dressing room, I managed to catch fleas, because such was the nature of the circus at that time. We had a lot of wild animals in there, and we had a lot of stagehands. I'm still not sure where I caught the fleas from. Probably the stagehands more than the poor animals.
Did you start your own flea circus?
No, if only had I been a little more canny, I would indeed have done that.
And how long did you stay in the circus?
I stayed there for a full season, at the end of which I was trying to think, well, what now? And Charlie, who had been very kind to me through the whole season and very forgiving of me being a really crap clown, he came up and he said, so what are you going to do now? And I said, I don't know. I said, I do know I'm not a clown. And he patted me on the back and he said, well done for recognizing that, because there are so many people out there who say they're clowns and they're not. They're just put on funny wigs and funny noses and so on. A clown is something magical. A clown is Charlie Chaplin, Stan Laurel. A clown is Ken Dodd, who's a very famous Liverpool comedian. And I knew that, and I got that, and I knew that, you know, no matter what I wore on, I would never have what those guys were born with, and indeed what Charlie Caroli was born with. He was a magnificent clown. And he said, well, tell you what you could do. I'm going into pantomime in a theatre in a place called Leeds. Why don't you see if you can get a job there backstage? So I had nothing else in my mind. I still didn't know how to break into comics. I was still 16. So I made my way over to Leeds and found this extraordinary theatre. It was an old music hall, which to Americans is like vaudeville house, you know. And it had been standing for 200 years. And I remember finding the stage door, and it was down this disgusting alleyway, really tiny alleyway. And as I walked down the alleyway, there were rats running towards me, and there were dustbins overflowing. And worse than that, there were 4 people doing the kind of thing a 16-year-old Catholic schoolboy should not be seeing at 9 o'clock in the morning, no less. So I'm like, oh, excuse me, can I just get past? And then, but everything changed when I opened the stage door. I walked through the stage door, and running down the stairs towards me was a wolf. And when he got to the bottom of the stairs, he looked round and he saw that he didn't have a tail. And he said, oh dear, I've left my tail in the green room. And he looked at me and he said, be a little love, will you, and run up to the green room and fetch my tail. And I remember thinking at that moment, I've found my home. This is my spiritual home. This is so cool. The reason the wolf was there was because they were in a production or a rehearsal for a pantomime that Christmas season of Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf. So I just met the wolf. So I went up to the green room, and there I met one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met, a man called Wally Coe, who was the stage manager, who was a character straight out of Dickens. And he said, just as Charlie had said months before, he said, what are you on? And I said, are there any jobs going? And he said, yeah. And I said, all right, when do you want me to start? He said, now. And so I was welcomed into the heart of music hall, where I stayed for several years because it was a delight. And I was able to work with some of Britain's favorite comedians, singers and dancers, and some huge names like Eartha Kitt, who came there, and who I immediately fell head over heels in love with. Mm-hmm. And to this day, I am still in love with Eartha Kitt. And my wife is aware of that, and she accepts it because Eartha was truly Catwoman, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. And despite what she once sang, that she was an old-fashioned girl, no way was she an old-fashioned girl. She was someone else. And she knew whatever it was she had. And she knew the effect it would have on a boy who was just turned 17 when he met her. And that's over 50 years ago now. And as I tell the tale, it still has the effect on me. I still see Eartha in front of me. What
would you say are the most important lessons you learned about the business itself while you worked backstage in Leeds?
I learned that the most important thing is how nice the people were, and how nice the people were to a 16-year-old Muppet, 17-year-old Muppet. These were big names, and they were very kind. They had a kindness to them. They were in the business because they loved it, and they would do anything to make their act work. Absolutely anything. They put the work in always, but they were a sheer delight. I don't have one bad memory of my time working with those wonderful people.
So what you're saying is, even as they were professionally, making good in the world by being a performer of some kind, whether they were a comedian or a singer or whatever, that at the same time, even though their act was substantially professional, they continued to improve it. Is that right?
No, absolutely. I mean, some of the acts that I met had been doing the same act from the 1920s.
Wow.
So again, talk about privilege for me to meet these guys who had been big names in Great Britain from the 1920s. And they'd been acts who had mastered the wireless, who had gone from playing the halls onto that amazing creation, the wireless, which is a true art form in itself,
Sure.
a fascinating art form. The spoken word on wireless, what one could do on that, and it's something that I have to say to this day I feel passionately about the wireless, right along with silent movies. I think just as silent movies sort of is a forgotten art form, how to create movies with no words. So I think is the wireless. It's been getting sidelined for way too long.
Well, podcasting has taken up a little bit of that slack.
This is true. Absolutely, this is true. And one of the delights of course, the internet is this wonderful connection to the globe, to the universe, which allows that and allows us to do it, as you and I are sitting here in our pajamas, talking to each other.
Speak for yourself.
I assumed that was your pajamas. Yes.
No, this is evening wear.
This is evening. Yes, quite.
All right. So how did you get from there into writing comics?
Although I'd been drawing and writing for all my life, basically, my long life, up to age 17.
So you were doing that while you were in the circus as well. You continued.
Oh, yeah. I carried on because it was just something I did. I mean, even down to writing diaries and journals. I've got diaries and journals, and that was something instilled in me by my parents because they had always written journals and diaries. And in fact, I do have on a shelf across the room from me now my mother's diaries from 1941, which are heartbreaking and heart-wrenching to read. She was 16 at the time, and that was the time of the Liverpool Blitz. And she had a house very close to the target points of the Luftwaffe. And she writes on May the 3rd, 1941, in pencil, 16-year-old handwriting. She writes, "I'm looking out of my bedroom window, and it looks as if the whole of Liverpool is on fire tonight."
Wow.
Well, anybody who's ever been to Liverpool, anybody with a heart, will get the importance of that line and how heartbreaking it is. And indeed, you can go online and type in Liverpool Blitz, and the photos that come up show you, it's a wonder any of the Beatles survived, or any of us that I'm here, quite frankly, because my parents should have been got, that's for sure. So diaries had always been a huge part of our life, and writing in general. It was just recognizing it as a form of communication, and communication was important in our family. We all communicated well. So I was sitting there one day backstage at the City Varieties Music Hall in Leeds, between shows, and I was actually writing a letter to my brother who had gone to live in Australia, and a very famous comedian came and sat down next to me because he was there to do a show that night. And he actually turned to me and he said, "Oh, you're a writer, are you?" And with typical Liverpool cheek, I said, "Oh, yeah, of course, yeah." Not letting him know that I was just writing a letter to my brother. And he said, "Well, I need scripts." I said, "Oh, really?" He said, yeah, I need scripts. Can you write some scripts for me? I said, "Yeah, of course." And I knew his act, so I knew the style of thing that he would want. And he said, "Well, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm coming back to the theatre in 2 weeks. So can you see what you can do for me?" So for the next 2 weeks between shows, I wrote different scripts. And the day before he was to come back, I remember reading through them all, and I junked all of them except two scripts I kept. And I thought, these are good, these work. And when he turned up at the theatre, I had them in my pocket, but I wasn't there was no way I would have been able to go over to him and say, oh, here's the scripts. But luckily, amazingly, considering this is a guy who's a real name, he came out, he said, have you got those scripts for me? And I said, oh, yeah, they're in my pocket. So I pulled them out, sat down next to him, and he started reading one. And not a titter from him, not a smile as he reads the first one. And I'm like, suddenly I'm covered in sweat, because this is, I recognize this is such an important moment in my 17 years on this planet. And he puts the first one down, and then he starts reading the second one. And then suddenly he starts laughing, chuckling. And I'm like, holy cow, Ronnie Corbett is laughing at something I've written, which is miraculous. And he gets to the end of it, and he says, yeah, very good, very good. And he reaches in his pocket, and he pulls out his wallet, and he hands over £25 to me, which was a hell of a lot of money back then, a real treasure trove. And he said, thank you very much. And I suddenly recognized, oh, I'm a writer. It was disbelief. Well, I mean, there's no better way. You know, this is better than any publisher accepting your work. This is a man who you've seen on the TV, who you've laughed at, who has entertained you, and he's laughed at the stuff you've written. So suddenly it's like, oh, right, that's interesting.
Ronnie Corbett is legendary.
He is indeed, probably most famous for being one half of a double act, the two Ronnies. But yes, any Americans tuning in, please do go on YouTube and just type in Ronnie Corbett, or indeed the two Ronnies, and you will be laughing your socks off.
Hilarious.
Probably not at my script, because I don't think that's up anywhere. And funnily enough, I can't even remember what the script was about now. I suspect it wasn't great. But you know what it did for me was great, because it gave me a belief in myself.
You've managed to stumble into show business 3 times in a row.
Oh, my whole life has been stumbling.
You
Totally.
Stumbled into the circus, you stumbled into Leeds, and you stumbled into Ronnie Corbett.
I have a better word for it than stumbling, though. And that word is synchronicity. Just the stars aligning. And I've been incredibly lucky in my life. I mean, I'm married to an American, for goodness sake. Well, I'm a little boy from Liverpool, and this is a little girl from Indianapolis, from a suburb of Indianapolis. How on earth do those two people meet on this planet of 7 billion? No, I've heard that somebody's counted again. It's now 8 billion people. How on earth do we find each other? But we've been together now for 36 years. And, you know, we met in an impossible way. So it's all been synchronicity, including working with my latest publisher, Teddy. You know, pure chance that our paths cross, and we find it's as if, well, I've known this person all my life, you know, and here we are.
What I'm partly getting at is that talent is a huge part of it. You have to have the talent in order to maintain once you've gotten your foot in the door like that. But so the talent is a piece of it, but luck plays a part, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because you know, I'm sure there's some, I often wonder, you know, if the Beatles hadn't met Brian Epstein, I suspect they would probably be sweeping the streets of Liverpool today. They needed that luck in meeting that right guy. That was synchronicity working at its finest, you know, no question. So there was an element of luck. You know, that's not taking anything away from the enormous talent that the Beatles had, that Brian had at all. It's just a fact that, yeah, but you can't wait for it. You cannot wait for it. The luck came to me because I actually got up off my ass and went over to Blackpool Tower Circus and knocked on a door as a 16-year-old. And, you know, not to brag and not to blow my own trumpet. Well, I might as well blow my own trumpet because nobody else will. But I think that I look back now fondly on that and think, well done, you know, for actually daring to do that as a 16-year-old. And I think that's great. Funnily enough, I didn't put that I'd worked at the circus on my CV, my resume, for years and years and years, because I always said, well, that's not going to, you know, mean anything to anybody. And it was only probably by the 80s that I suddenly thought, that is fantastic. That's like such a great thing to start your resume off with, that you were a clown in a circus, you know, and if the right people will get that and immediately say, that's interesting, I will read on with, you know, whatever this guy's, where do you go next? So yeah, luck, absolutely. And I am the luckiest guy on the planet, I would say.
Well, that's that's excellent. But you also back it up with the goods. You come in with real talent. So how do you get from there, from Ronnie Corbett, and you've sold a script, to a comedian? And how do you get to become
I started writing for other comedians as well. So while I was there, there's a wonderful double act called Little and Large, who trod the boards for many years in the UK. And I love them. They're lovely people. And I wrote several scripts for them. They were on TV at the time, and those scripts were up on their TV show. There was another guy called Jimmy Cricket, and I was writing for his TV show, and lots and lots of others. But one day I'm sitting backstage at this theatre again, and we suddenly have delivered 1,000 comic books from a publisher up in Dundee in Scotland. And they were the most famous comic book publishers in Britain at the time. And they were doing comics, funny comics for children, like the Beano and the Dandy and the Topper and the Beezer. So these weird names. And these comics have been running for years, and I'd read them all through my childhood. And I picked up some of the comics and started reading them. And I just suddenly thought, I can do this. I can do this, you know. And so I spent a month working on just telling news stories about some of the characters that they already had, established characters. And at the end of that month, I did the same thing again, where I read all the stuff that I'd written, and I junked all of it, except I actually think I sent off 4 of these stories to this comic company. And a week later, I got a response, because this is obviously pre-computers, pre-email, back when we had something called mail. And I got a response saying, we accept 2 of the stories, and here's a check. And I thought, my God, because this was in comic books I'd read as a child, and I was already nostalgic for my lost youth. You know, I look back fondly on my childhood because I'd had an absolutely terrific childhood. So suddenly I was doing these stories that were about characters I'd read about when I was a kid, and it was a lovely connection for me. And I was able to start telling stories. Well, because what they also said in this letter was, you know, if you've got any more, let us know. If you're ever in Dundee, come and see us. So I was like on the next coach up to Dundee, and went to see them. And it was there that I just started writing more and more comics and more comic characters. And it was a great training ground for how you do it and how you turn it out. And the beauty of that company was not only did they do comics, but they did newspapers and magazines. So suddenly I thought, well, I don't want all my eggs in one basket. And so I thought, I'll do interviews, because I've always been interested in people, and I love talking to them or talking at them. But I like to bring stories out of people. And there was a woman on TV at that time who I really fell head over heels with. And I thought, how cool would it be to go and interview her? That would be nice. And she was on a children's program in England called Blue Peter, a strange name for any American to hear for a children's show, I know. The Blue Peter is actually a flag that used to be raised on ships when it was going out on adventures. So that's what the show was named after, Blue Peter. And the show was sort of, it would have about 10 items every episode, showing kids how to do this, or what this was about, or how Nelson's column was created. So it was a great sort of education show, but done in a really nice way. And one of the presenters on it was this fantastic woman called Leslie Judd. And so I wrote off to the BBC and said, can I come and interview Leslie Judd for a piece in this magazine? And they wrote back saying, yeah, sure. When do you want to come? Oh, great. So I get a tape. I buy a tape recorder. Remember those things, a tape recorder? I buy a tape recorder because my shorthand is non-existent. And I write out my first series of questions for an interview session. And I think, okay, well, that's interesting. I would be interested in her answers to these. And I head up there and I go to the BBC, which was this legendary building that looked like a donut in central London. And I think, gosh, this is the place where so many of my favorite TV shows have been created, from Doctor Who to you name it. And I'm shown up to the Blue Peter office, and in comes Leslie Judd. And she's even more beautiful than she was on TV. And she comes and she sits incredibly close to me. And I find that she's got freckles. And this is devastating in a good way to a guy who's still, I think I was still 17 or maybe I was 18 by this time, but a very young 18, that's for sure. And then she sits me down on a sofa and our knees touch. And I pull my tape recorder out of the bag and I press it to start and the back falls off it. And 9 batteries roll across the floor in every direction. And it is a wonderful start to my interviewing career with the most beautiful woman on the planet, of course. She was a little love, and she was down on her hands and knees saying, oh, I'll find them, I'll get them. No, don't worry. No, here we go. So it was a great choice of first interviewee in that she was incredibly kind and recognized my deficiencies in the area of interviewing. I think. But she gave a great interview, and it was published, and it led to me being able to do a zillion interviews with wonderful people, always positive interviews, because at that time, I guess newspapers, particularly the rock press, were suddenly becoming bitchy and putting the boot in to everybody. And they were trying to, I think journalists were becoming characters in their own right, rather than recognizing that their job was to tell a story, to listen to the person that you're talking to and tell their story. But they were interjecting way too much with their own phony personality. Mm-hmm. That was my belief. So my interviews were very much where I would pull myself out of the interview completely. So my interviews would be them just talking, because that's who you pick the magazine up to read about.
How were your interviews then influential in writing stories for comics? Were they in some way?
Yeah, I think everything is, really. I mean, everything sort of has impact on you. And, you know, you're different with every anything that happens in your life is bound to have an effect on your writing.
One link in the chain just keeps leading to the next link in the chain.
It does. Even just listening to the way people speak and the way that they answer your questions, suddenly you get a handle on how to handle dialogue with characters, and little things that they can put in. You know, there's some people who will repeat themselves, who will say, so I said to this person, so I said to this person, you know, they will just it's like an underlining of, and that sort of is a great thing to drop into any story that you're writing, you know, because suddenly you're there in the room and you hear the voices in your head.
Well, this is good. This leads me to the heart of this, which is, all right, so dialogue is after you've figured out what the story is. You don't start with the dialogue. You start with who are the characters and what's the story, in whether you're doing a comic book or a novel or whatever it is you're doing, correct?
You know, I don't know because I think it's been different with different things that I've written down the years. I mean, obviously it's completely different. If you're telling a story about Spider-Man, then everything that's gone before is all important.
Of course.
And you mustn't change that. So you're sort of locked in to a certain extent with where you can go.
That world is already created and you're dropping into that world.
Absolutely. And you've got to have respect for that world, you know, I think. And it irks me when I find writers not having respect for what's gone before, particularly when we're talking about stuff that's gone before that has been written by legendary people like Stan Lee or Marv Wolfman or Len Wein or you know, any of these, Roy Thomas, of course, you know, these fabulous creators. You know, they got it right.
Whether you're creating a story based on an existing world or whether you're creating something whole cloth new, where do you typically begin? Do you begin with plot, with character, with tone? Where do you typically begin? Or is there no typical for you?
I don't think there's a typical, but often I find the beginnings will be in the middle of the night. And I used to come up with the best ideas in the middle of the night, and I'd think, oh, I'll remember them in the morning. And of course, never did, until I realized I've really got to get up out of bed and go and write the thing down. And then in the morning, I will read it and I will think, what on earth is this? Or I will think, that is a good idea, and I'm glad that I wrote it down. And it's like a little seed from which something grows. There's so many ways to write. What's particularly wonderful is when you get the characters right, because it is a fact that suddenly they do start taking you in directions you don't think you would have dreamed of yourself, which is really fascinating. It does become alive. And I'm a great lover of Dickens' stories, particularly his early work. I was almost going to do the Woody Allen joke of his early funny stuff. But it is his early funny stuff. I mean, his early stuff is really hilarious. And it irks me no end when I go into schools these days and I have teachers saying, oh, we don't teach Dickens anymore because he's not relevant to today. Are you kidding? Oh. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, give me a break, you know. He will be relevant 10,000 years from now, same as Chaucer. Dickens' characters, of course, are extraordinary, those early creations. And I love the fact that he was, in so many cases in those early books, obviously making it up as he went from an initial idea. And the reason he was working that way, because he was working for a monthly publication. And so it would sort of, his stories were created in installments. And at the end of each installment, there was sort of a cliffhanger. And you know, when you read those early stories, that he hasn't a clue how he's going to get this character out of this difficulty. And then you read the next chapter and he figures a way out. So I think Charles Dickens was making it up as he went along. To his later books are much more strict and for me, they lose a little of the joy of creation of his early work.
So the later work becomes more set up. He spends more time preparing the story rather than just winging it.
And thereby losing that joy of, well, when you're reading the early stuff, it's as if he's there in the room with you. It really is as if he's with you, just reading it out, or not even reading it out. It's coming out of his head. You know, and that's what you feel with that early stuff, I think.
Do you feel in your own work, like many creators do, that a lot of it is not actually you, but coming through you as a conduit from somewhere else?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I'm often asked, where do ideas come from? You got me. I have no idea where they come from. You know, particularly the good ideas. It's like, and sometimes what develops from an idea is something completely different to what the idea was that you wrote down on a piece of paper all those months ago, you know. So it sparks.
What for you makes a good story work? What for you makes a good story good?
Humor. And I think that's partly to do with my upbringing in Liverpool. Liverpool, when I first came to the US, I was given a job over there as humor editor of the Saturday Evening Post. And the reason I was given that job was because the publisher, she said, oh, you can be our humor editor because you're supposed to be funny from Liverpool, aren't you? So word had spread. And I can only thank John, Paul, George and Ringo for obviously that was the influence there that had got into my publisher's mind. And indeed, they were funny. But that funniness is typical of Liverpudlians, as we're called. There is a definite humor. I mean, very, very similar to New York. I mean, a different style of humor, but New York people are funny as well. So it's that. Heaven knows why. You know, what is it about this strange little city in northern England? But it is funny. Whenever I go out now, I get a train into Liverpool. It takes about 40 minutes into the center of Liverpool. And always somebody will sit down next to me and start talking about something. You don't get that in many places. But whatever they're talking about will be hilarious. And it doesn't matter what age they are. It might be some kid of 15. It might be some old codger of my age. You know, it will be hilarious.
How often has that happened to you and it turned into something that you profited from, where you wrote it up? Anything?
I write it up. Yeah, these days, or for many years now, I tend to write these things up. I used to write journals. When Facebook came on the scene, I realized that this is a beautiful way of communication. I love Facebook myself. I know a lot of people say, oh, but I find it a great form of communication and an instant communication. And so I tend to write my diaries, I guess you could say, or my thoughts for the day, or indeed what I've encountered and what I've seen and what I've heard on the train. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting on the train and there was this very scouse, that means very Liverpudlian, teenage girl sitting next to me. And she was sticking her nails on, her big, Ming the Merciless, like nails.
Her fake nails.
Fake nails, yeah. And she'd done one hand and then she said, oh, God, hey, mister, do you have any nail glue with you? It was such a joyous question that I have to say I'd never been asked before in my life. I responded by saying, no, I don't, but I do have some chewing gum. Will that work? And I was tickled enough by it that I thought, well, I've got to write that up when I get home, because it's like a typical moment in Liverpool life. And she was totally serious.
And what is wrong with you that you don't carry nail glue around with you?
Well, I don't know. In my youth, I probably would have, but these days I've let it all go. This is as good as it gets, unfortunately.
So you have written both what you would call the ultimate short forms, i.e., a single panel cartoon, and you've written the ultimate long form, which would be a novel or an ongoing series. And so I think of the short form as being the harder of the two. Do you agree?
It depends on the idea. And you know what? When it flows, it flows. I don't think I can judge it like that. I think it just depends on the idea and how it catches me when I'm writing it. And suddenly, that delightful moment when I'm writing something and then I think, oh, I better read this back. And I read it and I go, this is really funny, this, because it comes out a mile a minute and there's no time to think about it. It's just coming down on the page or on the screen. And so to go back and read it and then, and I often trial things up on Facebook, because I've got however many so-called friends out there. And it's really nice, particularly with some of them, to get that ha response. It means a lot, from age 16 to age whatever I am now. I still love that ha response, whether I'm in the circus ring or sitting at my computer.
Well, who doesn't like to tell a joke and get a laugh,
Yeah, quite. I guess I've never in my life told a joke. I don't think I would never describe anything that I've done as a joke. Telling a joke as such, and I don't think I have that in me to be able to do that,
or a story, but
I love words. I adore words and what one can do with them and where they can go and where they can lead you in a sentence, so without sounding too pompous and up myself when I say that.
So I'm wondering, in your career, you've clearly worked with many other people. It's a collaborative business in certain ways, both in comic books and in novels and script writing and so on. I assume over time you have received notes from people, from editors, publishers, etc. How do you handle notes? What's the way that you look at note giving and note taking?
I have a real belief in my abilities, and like most people probably in the arts, that's a very important thing to have. And I guess that at times that can cross over into sheer arrogance, quite frankly. That self-belief becomes arrogance. So I'm always interested in what they write, but I like an editor to know his or her place. And his or her place is to choose the right writer for a project and the right illustrator to combine together if we're doing comic books, for example, and then to say, okay, now do your magic and let it come forth. And then what I like them to do is to look and read through it, say ha if necessary, but also tell me, well, you've left a comma out there, or it would be even better if you. So I like that kind of thing, and having worked as an editor myself for many years, that's how I work as an editor. I choose the right people to work with. I then don't put my vision onto them, apart from what I will have said up front with, what we need here is this. But I've chosen them for all the right reasons, because I know they can create something which will surprise me, hopefully, because, they're the ones with this artistic magic.
And does it ever happen where work comes back and it's just not up to snuff? Or has that never happened?
Yeah, it has done, actually.
So then what do you do? How do you handle that?
Well, I remember the one time that comes to mind was long, long ago. And I was there was a shopping mall opening in a town in England. And I went to them and I sold them on the idea of, you know what, we could create a comic book for you on that opening day, and you can hand it out, and we'll create a mascot for the shopping mall. And I've got this fab new artist that's working with me. He's just 18 and he's terrific. And his name's Charlie Adlard. Now, I don't know if the name Charlie Adlard means...
that's The Walking Dead.
Yeah, very good indeed. Well, Charlie came knocking on my door one day when he was 18 years of age, and he had heard me on the radio blethering on about something or another, and he said, could you give me some advice, because I don't know where to go in my life. I either want to be a rock drummer or I want to be working comics. And I said, well, can I see some of your stuff? He said, yeah, but I should warn you. He said, I've just got a letter back from the editor of the Dandy comic, and the editor of the Dandy comic says that my work isn't sophisticated enough for the Dandy. The Dandy is this funny little English comic book that ran for about 70 years, and it was great, but it was far from sophisticated. The Saturday Evening Post is sophisticated. This worked because it wasn't sophisticated. So it was a ridiculous rejection letter for sure. And I looked at Charlie's work and I said, this is great. You really got something. But he'd been hit by this rejection letter. So I said, look, come up into my office and we'll sit down and we'll create a sophisticated comic strip. And we sat down and I looked around, and I had just come over from the States at that time. And I had on my desk a copy of Virgin Airlines glossy in-flight magazine. And I said, look, they don't have a strip in there. Let's do a strip for them. So we created a 3-frame strip and we sent it off to them. And 2 days later, Charlie was a professional comic book cartoonist. Wow. Because they accepted it. Anyway, back to the story. Shortly after that, I heard that this shopping mall was opening, and sold the idea to the shopping mall that we'll do. And I was going to get Charlie to do most of the work in the comic, because I thought it. So I got him to, and I said, well, we need a really special cover. Anyway, unbeknownst to me, Charlie was about to head off on his holidays. So he did what I can only describe as a rush job, and it was bloody diabolical. And so I had to go to him and say, oh, this is, do you really think this would represent you well? And he recognized it wouldn't, so he redid the thing, and all was well in the world. And for the next few years, we actually did many, many strips together. They were usually funny animal strips. So, and we had them in magazines and newspapers and whatever. And then suddenly got a job on 2000 AD, a famous comic in Great Britain. And by that time I was working for Marvel Comics, and I brought him in to do Spider-Man covers, and his career took off. And I was always trying to pull him back to do more funny animal stuff. And then he got the X-Files, and then he went on to do The Walking Dead. Whenever I meet him now, and we bump into each other quite a lot, I always say to him, just imagine if you had stuck with the funny animals where you could be today, Charlie. And of course, today he actually owns Shrewsbury just about, which is his hometown. And he is indeed one of the biggest comic book people on the planet. And a lovely guy to boot.
And in fact, as we record this episode last night in America, I don't know if it was true in England or not, but in America, we had the finale of the series, the TV series of The Walking Dead.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that was a big deal. So I want to talk about the Jolly Bloodbath.
I love talking about that.
Tell the listeners what the Jolly Bloodbath is all about. It's quite something.
It is quite something. Well, nobody knows this story, or nobody knows the story behind the Jolly Bloodbath. And the story behind the Jolly Bloodbath is a jolly good story in its own right. And it started about a year ago. And my brother is called Jason Quinn, and he works in the comic book world as well for many, many years. He's won all sorts of awards for, he worked for many years in India for a graphic novel company, which is one of the best graphic novel companies on the planet, called Campfire Graphic Novels. Anybody out there, please do tune into them. And one of the books he did for them was the life story of Gandhi, and it won every award under the sun, and rightly so. Anyway, Jason and I have known each other all our lives, of course, because we're brothers. And he's 10 years younger than me. But he's worked at Marvel. He's currently editing Batman. But about a year ago, we were chatting on Zoom, and he was working with some editor that he didn't agree with. And he was like, oh, where do these nitwits come from? And why are they always editors? And I was having a similar experience with an editor myself. And I was saying, I know. And then he said, will you listen to us? We're such a miserable old pair. And I said, yeah, do you remember when we were kids and how we were writing and drawing all the time? And we used to create rival comics when we were kids that we would give to each other at Christmas. And we said, yeah, that was such a blast, wasn't it? You know, and we were just doing it for the joy of writing. And he said, well, yeah, we should do that again. And I said, yeah, all right, let's do it. Well, he said, should we write a book? And I said, yeah, okay. He said, how should we start? I said, let's just start. What do you want it to be about? He said, well, I like pirates. And he said, every kid loves pirates. Every generation loves pirates. I said, that's right. Okay. So we came off Zoom. I just came to the computer and started writing something about pirates, an opening passage about the time of the piratical age. And then it went into a brief story that connected to my very first school. And my very first school was a convent. When I was 4 years of age, I was sent to a convent school with nuns. And these nuns were your old-fashioned nuns, you know, with the full habits and the rosaries that were like a kosh, you know, were big, huge things. So nuns had always played a part in my dreams ever since then, because they were dreamlike characters, very extraordinary women. And I thought, well, pirates and nuns would be a great way to start this story. So the chapter that I wrote had an encounter between the world's most horrendous pirate, a man so horrendous that his mother actually named him Captain Murderer at birth, and these nuns who were out for a jaunt in a rowing boat. I won't tell you what happens next, other than I finished that chapter, sent it to my brother. He immediately wrote back with 2 words saying, ha ha, and followed that by writing the next chapter. I read his chapter and I was inspired to write the next chapter. And then he wrote the next, and so on. And it's the easiest book I've ever written in my life, the easiest thing I've ever written. We were laughing throughout it. We thought, this is great. And the reason we were doing it was to amuse and entertain ourselves and to get back our mojo, I guess you could call it, you know, of loving writing. We were not writing it with the intent of sending it to a publisher, because what we were putting in the book, we knew every publisher under the sun would say, you can't do that. You can't have that, because we'll have parents complaining, because this is a children's novel.
Well, it gets a little bloody and a little violent in there some places.
Just a tad. But the blood and the humor and the gore is underlined with a Liverpudlian sense of Beatlesque humor, I do believe.
I agree.
If I say so myself, and that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So we got to the end of the book, and there it was on my on my computer screen, just there. And we just left it there, because that was, yeah, okay, that was fun, wasn't it? Yeah, we should do something again sometime. Yeah, right. And we carried on with our lives. He carried on doing whatever he was doing, writing. I carried on doing what I was doing a lot of work for a wonderful Liverpool charity called Liverpool Heartbeat, a children's charity, creating comic books for them. And then into my life came this extraordinary publisher from Norway called New Haven Publishing, who was starting a children's imprint called Phoenix Press. And I sent them an idea because I thought, you know what, we're coming up to the 60th anniversary of the Beatles. And I would love to do the Beatles story in comic strip form. And so I wrote off to the head of this company, a wonderful woman called Teddy. And 10 minutes later, she made contact and she said, let's talk. So we did a Zoom thing. And she explained what she was looking for in her company and that they were entering the children's field. And she said, do you have a novel that might work for children? And I looked at my computer screen and I saw sitting there The Jolly Bloodbath. And I thought, well, you know what? It'll be funny just to get a reaction to this. At least she's going to read it because she's going to. So I sent it off thinking, I will be able to send her reaction to my brother. And we'll both laugh that a publisher's just said, you must be joking. Anyway, half an hour later, she writes back saying, this is exactly the kind of book I'd like to read to my children. And I'm like, wow. Talk about synchronicity. This is exactly the kind of publisher I've been seeking for all my life. So we both think, my brother and I, we go, great, we better read it again to see what we've written here, So we write it and we read it and we're thinking, well, this is great, actually. This, with a year, it's been a year since we finished it. And you can judge something, after that length of time when you're not so close to it. And we thought, yes, it's a really good book. This is an absolutely fantastic book, actually. And, we could see that it's a book that could have many spin-offs. And also it could easily be turned into a TV series, easily be turned into a movie. It's got the lot, really, everything that you want a children's book to have. So, of course, we signed on with Teddy and New Haven. And we're delighted that, that's just come out. And she's asked for, where's the sequel, which is very exciting. But for me, writing that book was sheer joy. I love working with my brother. Again, it connects me to our childhood, which we had a blast with. When we talk about it being bloody and whatever, that doesn't put some people off because it is more than anything a laugh-a-minute book.
Well, it's right in your title, Bloodbath.
Yes, it is. Yes, indeed it is. Yeah, but that is preceded by the word jolly.
Yes.
Which is a very English word. So the two words sort of tip you off. I must say, the Jolly Bloodbath, for those out there, is the name of this pirate ship.
Yes. Pitch to the listeners just the 2-3 liner about what is the story about in general.
Okay. Well, the story is about a group of disadvantaged children, really, who are up against it in the end of the 1700s, and they really have everything comes back to the Beatles, a Beatle sort of sensibility about them, in that they're going to take over the world, but they're up against the most horrendous pack of villains you could imagine. Not only this ghastly pirate, Captain Murderer, but his cohort, a head teacher of a school, and his name is Dr. Brute, well named, methinks. And the children, a mix, a lovely gang of kids, lead the way in this huge adventure, which brings in the king himself, which brings in the legendary sirens of the sea, and which brings in the Spanish menace of that period. And anybody who knows anything about British history will know that Britain was always under threat of invasion, particularly from the Spanish or indeed the French. So this all collides in this extraordinary dreamlike landscape that my brother and I have created. But it's been created certainly from our hearts, certainly from our Liverpool upbringing, So I would say anybody who likes the Beatles and gets the Beatles, that is, you don't just see them as, oh yeah, they did some good songs, didn't they? No. They did so much more than that. They created a way of thinking across the world. And so it is with the characters in this book.
And you've set it in a huge adventure.
And it is indeed a huge adventure, which I like to think will continue into another huge adventure as soon as we clear the decks with all the stuff that we're writing at the moment.
Did this book go through an editorial process at all, or once you delivered it, that was it? It went out.
Well, now here's the thing: both myself and my brother are editors of notes.
Sure.
So we kind of wrote it with that in mind, but we also wrote it as a rebellion against the ridiculous publishers of today, who will say, oh, no, you can't do this because that will upset Mrs. Thingy, who lives in Rhode Island or lives in, Birmingham or something. We don't care about her. We're writing directly for children. And when I say we're writing for children, that means the child in you, because we all still have that child in us that wants to be taken on an Alice in Wonderland adventure, or a Treasure Island adventure, I guess, in this case. That still appeals to us. We don't write in a childish way. We write for children.
There's nothing childish about this book.
No.
Nothing childish at all. It's in fact
childhood is. I like to think that, have I grown up? No, I like to think that I'm still about 12 in so many ways. Now, what was it? There's a great quote from J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, and he says that life is all downhill after the age of 2. And I remember reading that the first time and thinking, oh my God, that's a bit negative. And then I suddenly realized, no, that's the most positive thing ever. Because of course, it's after the age of 2, when you turn 3, that suddenly you're getting on the treadmill of nonsense, and you get up in the morning and you do teeth, and you eat your breakfast, and you walk the dog, and then you're getting ready to go to school. And then after the school, you're getting ready to go to work, and it's this, and there's no time to think anymore. Whereas before 2, everything is just magical and golden. And the best example of that I've got is when my little brother, who I wrote this book with, when he was not even 2, when he was younger than 2, when he was a baby in his crib, we put him outside. We had a lovely garden in Liverpool. We put him outside, and my mother said, oh, go and check on him, because it's the summer. It was the summer. Go and check that he's not in the sun. So I crept to make sure he wasn't, hoping he wasn't awake. And I found that he was awake, but he hadn't spotted me. And he was actually looking up, and he was waving. His little hand was waving. And I thought, what is he waving at? He was obviously looking at something and waving with a little smile on his face. And I looked and I looked and I looked. And then I suddenly realized, because at this time I was 10 years of age, I looked up and I saw that what he was waving at was waving back at him. And it was the leaves on the tree overhead who were rustling in the wind and waving back to him. And it was one of the most beautiful moments in my life, because I wouldn't have seen it. I was already too old to figure that one out myself. But he, as a baby, saw that the tree was communicating with him. And indeed, the tree was communicating with him. And I totally believe that to this day. And by the time we're 3, we lose sight of that. We begin to lose sight of the wonders of this heavenly world that we're living on, So,
well, there's a certain amount of childlike wonder in the book itself.
Thank you. Yeah, childlike. Yes, childlike without being childish.
That's exactly right.
That's exactly.
There's I'm saying this. I've read the book. There's nothing childish in the book. There is a childlike wonder in the book.
Well, then I guess that comes from my favorite children's books, like Alice in Wonderland and Winnie the Pooh. And,
absolutely. Sure.
Wind in the Willows, So not that I'm putting my book alongside those, but I'm saying, are they inspirations? Of course they're inspirations. They're inspirations for my life.
Let's talk for a moment about your autobiography, because
yes,
it's quite something. You've had. We've talked quite a bit about your life on this show. And in fact, some of what we've talked about is reflected in the book. But I'm just wondering, what were the biggest challenges in you having to go back into your memory and bring all this onto a page? Was it challenging for you, or was it easy?
It was easy because through my life, I've kept diaries and journals. So it was comparatively easy. Having said that, at the end of it, I fell into I'm not going to use the word depression because, boy, is that an overused word these days. But I felt incredibly down when I put the final full stop.
Would you call it a funk?
I would indeed call it a funk. Yes, I like that word very much. A blue funk, no less. And it lingered for about a week. And at the end of it, I was thinking, well, why am I feeling like that? And I suddenly realized it was because all these characters who I've met in my life that I'd brought back to life, most of them are dead now. It's a great sales pitch for the book, isn't it? I did to. But it was having them, these amazing people, this varied cast of characters who I've encountered through my life, whether it's Beatles or whether it's friends of Beatles like the wonderful Derek Taylor, their fantastic publicist for many years. All of these people were suddenly back in front of me for the months that it took me to write this book. And they were this cast of characters were filling my office. And suddenly when I finished the book, it was like, whoop, they've gone back into the ether, I guess. And it was that. But then on realizing that was why I was feeling down, I sort of immediately bounced back, because it was the realization of how lucky I've been to have encountered these wondrous people in my life, you know. But I think, yeah, a very natural feeling to have when you come to the end of your autobiography.
Did you outline the book before you started, or did you just go?
I think I started at the start, and I went on to
chronologically then.
Pretty much, except suddenly I reached a point where I thought, okay, that's told most of my story, and then I thought, but then the ideas kept coming, the memories kept coming. And I started writing them down at the end. So the book is kind of in two halves. The first half is sort of the continuity is perfect. You know, it's following me from 1953 in Liverpool onwards through the birth of the Beatles and so on, and through to the present day. But then suddenly, after I'd finished that, all these other ideas, oh God, I didn't put that in. And I wrote them out. It was like having more notes and notes and notes. And then I fleshed those out. And I just put them at the end as sort of, well, the memories didn't stop there. And here's one now. So the second half of the book is leaping backwards and forwards through time, which I love that way of writing, because many of the characters I've created in my life have actually been time travelers. I love the concept of time travel. I mean, I did a lot of stuff working for Doctor Who magazine and working with the whole TARDIS idea of traveling here, there, and everywhere, you know. But many of the characters that I've created have had the ability to travel through time. And the second half of the book is very much like that. So one minute you're in 1958 and the next you're in 1986. As you know, I head into Indianapolis for the first time, and then suddenly you're back in 1971 with the horrific growth of glam rock, and which for me was like, are you kidding me? I've just had the 60s. What is this? And then you leap forward to the 1990s, you know, and when my wife and I start our own publishing company. Then it's another memory from running our music agency and a management company. So the ideas are just flip-flopping through time. Like remember in the old movies, whenever something moved through time, you'd see calendar dates falling out of the air, that beautiful image. And it's a bit like that. And I'm really happy with the way that's presented. But, you know, the book also has, because I'm a keen photographer, my grandparents were keen photographers, my parents were keen photographers. So the book is fully illustrated with pictures from behind the scenes at Marvel Comics, you know, pictures that have never been seen before, with memorabilia, you know, letters from Stan Lee, and all sorts of things that have been cluttering up my office for years and years and years.
Oh, there's lots of interesting things to look at in the book, no question.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. Yeah, I mean, it had to be a visual experience because my life has been that, you know.
Sure.
I mean, even our novel, there's no pictures in the novel that my brother and I wrote, and we came up with the comic author's credit of the brothers Quinn rather than the brothers Grimm. which I love. There's no pictures in the novel, but I like to think it's possibly the most visual writing we've ever written.
It's quite visual.
So the images, are there.
How did you arrive at the title ARG? And I'm going to spell it because I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. It's ARGH, which is a standard word used in comics and in cartoon writing and so on to mean some kind of.
It's usually spoken when a grand piano drops on your foot. So I could imagine Oliver Hardy saying it very well. And yes, how you pronounce it is up to you.
Sure.
Because it is usually seen on the comic page rather than heard in real life.
You're not going to find it in the Oxford English Dictionary.
Sadly not yet, but hopefully this book will change that. I think it's a beautiful word. I've always loved it. And funnily enough, when I started writing comics, I had the word ARG in a frame, and my mother saw it. She said, "Oh, that's interesting, because that was your first word on this planet. First thing you said was ARG." And recently, in writing this book, I've realized that chances are it will probably be the last word I speak on this planet too before I drop. So it sort of tops and tails the book very nicely, I think, and is a perfect title for an autobiography of anybody, but particularly somebody who has dawdled around in the comic book world through many of his years.
Well, it works quite well, though. It was very surprising. I wouldn't have expected to see that word as a title of a book. That's for sure.
Well, that's excellent. Then that I mean, the first thing that you learn when you're putting a book cover together is how do you make somebody look at that cover and do a double take when they're in a bookshop and they're walking by and there's 10,000 books in there. What's going to catch their eye quickly and make them look again? And hopefully that word will do
that and a really good illustration of some kind or a photo of some kind, that's what will also attract people.
This is true. And I like to think we have got a really nice illustration on that cover. It is me ripping my shirt open to reveal my concave chest and a lightning bolt on my chest. So in very superheroic pose. But as you know, I am an Englishman, and there are no superheroes in England, that's for sure, because we are short asses, for want of a better word. You have to be American-sized, handy-dandy American-sized, to justify getting on a pair of skin tights. So I wanted the cover of my autobiography to be humorous, and I could think of nothing more funny than to have me wearing a pair of horn-rimmed Clark Kent-type specs and ripping my shirt open to reveal not a huge S, but rather a lightning bolt, as in Captain Marvel, and indeed the horrendous sight of my concave physique.
It would only be better if Charlie Caroli had come along and poured cold water down your tights.
If only he could do that, I would be very, very happy. I mean, it's a memory that stayed with me, as you can imagine. You don't forget such things, particularly when there's 10,000 people laughing at you and your wet.
That would be completely memorable, no question.
Yes.
So in all of your long career, you've already told us an amazing number of hilarious stories, but in all of your long career, can you share with us a singular story that stands out for you as being either weird, odd, strange, offbeat, quirky, or just plain funny?
Yeah, sure. Well, I like to name drop because, I mean, I've met so many famous people and wonderful people, and I'm not ashamed to be a name dropper because I like to tell their stories, and I think people are interested in them. And Stanley was my hero from when I was a kid, growing up in Liverpool from age 7, reading his comic books, which he was writing at the time, and that was before the Fantastic Four, so before the superhero explosion that he brought about in the 60s. I loved his work even then, and of course was blown away when he did start doing the superhero stuff in the 60s. So imagine the joy for me when I finally get to meet him and work with him and suggest that I interview him, because at that time I was working as a producer on a TV series in Great Britain called The South Bank Show, which I know is available on goodness knows which channel, probably PBS, I would imagine, over in the US. It's a documentary TV series. It's been running for about 40 years, I think now. And it looks at, well, popular culture. And I wrote to them one day, the head of this TV series, and said, you should do a show about Marvel Comics. And I remember dropping the letter in the letterbox and then thinking, oh, as if they're going to do that, because they were a bit highfalutin what they were doing. And this was back when Marvel was celebrating its 50th anniversary. Anyway, something about my letter must have captured the imagination of them. And I got a letter back saying, we want to do this. Next time you're in London, come and see us. So I flew over to London and met with them. And they said, the problem is none of our producers know anything about comic books. So will you produce the show yourself? And I, again, a typical Liverpudlian, said, oh, yeah, sure. I remember walking out of the room thinking, how the heck do you produce, such a glossy TV show as this? But I was in luck, because the simple fact was that I knew my story back to front. I knew the story I wanted to tell, Marvel's story, and I knew the center point was interviewing Stan. So at this stage, I had had some dealings with Stan, so he knew who I was. So I was able to make contact with him, and he said, yeah, great, come along to the Marvel offices in New York. So we headed over there, but I was greeted at the door by the head of marketing at Marvel, a wonderful woman who shall remain nameless forevermore. And she took me aside and she said, okay, you're going in to interview Stan. Now, whatever you do, don't mention DC Comics. And she said, I mean it. And if you mention DC Comics, I will stop the filming. So you mustn't mention our rival. DC Comics, for those of you out there who are thinking, who's DC Comics? Not Washington, DC, but DC Comics, Detective Comics. That's the main rival to Marvel, and that's Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and all those wonderful characters. So I'm like seething, because this is idiotic, because the whole purpose of this interview was to get a really thorough interview on the comic business from Stan. But I thought, oh, well, it's Stan Lee, so I'm just gonna go in and just see what he says. So we go in, we sit down. The first thing Stan says to me as the cameras are being set up is, you do realize I can only remember 5 minutes ago. But of course he was joking. So the head of marketing stands behind the camera in my vision, ready to attack, and cameras roll. And I asked my first question to Stan, and I say, Stan, can you tell me how it all started? And he said, yeah, well, it all started at DC Comics. And for the next half hour, he extolled the virtues of DC Comics and how without Siegel and Schuster, the creators of Superman, none of this would be here today. And I'm looking over Stan's head at this idiot, for want of a better word. And of course, there's no way she's going to stop Stan. She would have jumped in had it been me, but she knew she could not stop Stan.
He could bring it up, but you can't.
Exactly that. So we made sure that we kept a lot of that in because of course it's relevant, and it's that kind of nonsense that I've fought against all my life, usually unsuccessfully, I have to say. The fight is a never-ending one, and it's an attitude that's grown and grown over the years. These nitwits who are in every part of the arts that you can imagine. They're in the music business. They're these people who justify their position by saying, I've got to be seen to be doing something, and they are clueless. And it is ghastly. And a best example of that is after the interview, which was great, and it's available up on YouTube. Seek it out. It's a wonderful thing. After that interview with Stan, he took me around the Marvel offices, and I was chatting to him. I said, how different is it today to how it was, because this was 1993. How different is it to how it was in the 60s? I said, when I was reading the comics originally. And he said, it's no comparison. He said, back then, there were, on a good day, 4 of us here. I said, how many are there here now? He said, there's about 200 of them. I said, and do you know them? He said, I know one thing, and that is that I don't want to know most of them, which I worked more and more for Marvel Comics, and I found that was exactly how I felt about the departments within departments within departments. The editorial was always fabulous. But above the editorial, the best example of this is in the UK, because Marvel at that time had a thriving office in the UK called Marvel UK. And we had a beautiful office just off the Strand, where Fleet Street meets the Strand. So beautiful old ancient building. And we had the editorial offices. And the editorial offices, we had hardwood floors. And above us were the marketing department. And they had carpets and curtains. And they had so much money to spend. And they were clueless about the product that we had to sell to the world. This, you know, I should stress, this was before the movies really took off.
Sure.
But anybody with a brain would be able to look at the creations of Stan and the gang back in the 60s and recognize that as soon as the technological things caught up, these would be the best movies ever to create. You know, anybody could have spotted that. But these nitwits, of course, couldn't realize it. So it was a constant battle. I mean, you know, working at Marvel, for me, my main memories of working for Marvel were that it was sheer joy. But that doesn't rule out the fact that some days was sheer hell because you were having to put up with the claptrap from licensing and marketing departments who just didn't get it, and you know, don't to this day, I think, you know, and probably even more so these days now that it's owned by the mouse.
Indeed. So, all right, last question for you today, Tim. You've already shared with us an enormous number of great pieces of advice and tips along the way, but do you have a single solid piece of advice that you like to tell people who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit and they're trying to get to the next level? Is there something you tell people like that?
Yeah, I dread the question because I'm often asked that, and I've been asked it for years. And the simple fact is that probably every wonderful creator that I've met within the business got in a different way. And of course, how I got in is probably completely irrelevant to how anybody would get in today, because we are living in a different universe now. You know, I got in back at the tail end of the 60s, early 70s, and it was a different world here in the UK. And I got into a series of weekly comics here, and by being in them, it allowed me to then present myself to other companies and say, well, I've done work for them. And that meant something, you know, because once you're in, you're kind of in, but it's getting in. How do you break in? Well, advice, if I dare, with my gray hair, pass on advice to people who are young and thrusting today, who probably have more of a clue. What I would say, first of all, is when I was editing a Spider-Man comic, I would get a mailbag of stuff sent to me every day of new artwork from everybody. And there was no time to look at it because we were producing goodness knows how many comics every week. Did I use new people? I certainly did. Who were they? They were people who got in my face. They were people who sold themselves to me. And where would they do that? They would do that at conventions where Marvel would have a stand, or they would seek me out. Charlie Adlard himself, Mr. Walking Dead, came knocking on my door one day. And I would have probably been mightily cheesed off had he not had some fabulous artwork to show me. But of course, I'm always interested to see fab artwork, because even to this day, I'm still working on projects, you know, on new projects, different projects. So I'm fascinated. Just yesterday, I was at a comic convention in Liverpool, and a 15-year-old girl came up, and we were talking about Marvel and her love of Marvel and all things. And no, actually, this isn't the 15-year-old girl. That was another story. But this was a 23-year-old girl. She was working as a nurse. And it's like, you know, boy, do you have to be inspired to want to go into nursing in Britain at this moment in time. And bless her. And you could feel that she was the perfect nurse. There was just something about her, that aura, you know. And I said, well, so was it always nursing? She said, no. I wanted to get into comic books. I said, oh, what happened? She said, well, I got into nursing. I said, do you still draw? She said, yeah, I draw all the time. It's very helpful to bring me down from what I see each day. And I said, oh, that's great. Do you have any of your work with you? She said, well, I've got something on my phone, but do you really want to see it? I said, I'd love to see it. Anyway, she showed me this stuff, and it was like anime stuff, which I've never really worked in. And I said, well, this is perfect timing, because I'm so conscious when I go into schools these days that the first thing kids say is that they love anime. They say that before they say they love Marvel. You know, they love anime more than anything. I said, and I'm very conscious with the comics I've been turning out over the last few years that I don't have anything that looks anything like anime, because I'm working in most cases with people who've been in the business for a long, long time and are more your old school sort of Marvel and DC artists, you know. And I said, well, send me this, you know, let's get together on Facebook and send me more material, because I'm sure that I will be able to make use of it. So that was purely by accident, but she was there at a comic convention and she was chatting to somebody who worked in comic books. So I guess my advice is to put yourself out. You have to learn to sell yourself. A lot of artists, I find, and a lot of writers, they get into the business because basically they want to retreat from the world and they want to sit at home in their attic or their garret and draw and write. And they're no good at then selling themselves. The usual thing when people do come up to me and show me artwork, the first thing they'll say is, this isn't very good, but, and I always say to them, if it's not very good, why are you showing it? If you don't believe in it, why the heck do you think I should? I said, so the first thing you got to learn is to believe in the work that you're presenting to somebody. And if you don't, then don't show it to them. You know, learn to edit yourself. My overall advice, though, would be to do it. Just do it. And then, you know, maybe you're in a town in the back of Beyond, and maybe they have a local paper still. Are the local papers still out there? Or maybe there's an online newspaper. I bet you that newspaper doesn't have a comic strip. It's a great way to start. Say that you're in the back of Beyond of, maybe you're in a little town in Indiana called Fishers, which is just outside Indianapolis. Well, I remember from my time there, that was a newspaper called the Fishers Gazette. Now, I don't know if it's still running, but say you were living in that town. Check it out, see if they've got a comic strip. If they haven't, suggest that you create one that will be in tune with the newspaper's audience. So maybe you could create a superhero called Captain Fishers. He's the superhero who actually is in that town. And then you could drop things into your strip that are actually in that town, you know, buildings and so on. You could actually have your superhero working for the Fishers Gazette. Now, I'm using the Fishers Gazette as an example, but the same applies to any town or city where you might be living. Find somewhere where you can get your work published and sell it to them, but make sure you get money for it. You know, way too many people these days will say, okay, well, we don't have any funding for this. Tell them to find it, but make sure that it's worth their finding it, and explain to them that it will add personality to their publication, because comic strips do. And that was recognized way back in the 1920s, when there used to be a lot more comic strips in newspapers. Well, I mean, you can go back to the 1950s and 60s and 70s even, and there was still an awful amount of newspaper comic strips, which were fantastic. You know, everything.
Well, there used to be a whole lot more newspapers, period.
Well, this is true. So but you know, whether they've gone online or whatever, again, seek these things out. Seek out publications, go to the newsstand, flick through magazines. If it hasn't got a comic strip, give them one. Create a comic strip that would work. You know, maybe there's a magazine about pets. I don't mean Penthouse. Maybe there's a magazine about houses, you know, country houses or something. Maybe they need a strip at the front of it, you know. Look, and maybe there's a magazine about books. Write a strip about a bookseller. You know, just get yourself published and get some money coming in. Well, and then you can approach bigger publishers with your ideas and say, look, I'm already an established writer or artist or whatever. And if you're a writer, find an artist to work with you if you want, you know, if you want to do
this is a fabulous bit of advice, because what you're saying is forge your own path. And
that's the best I can say, really, because that's what I did. You know, I don't know anybody who's done it the way I did. And also because time has now passed, I would say it was probably easier back then. But then I'm not really up with all things that are on the internet. And so if you're a younger person than me, and that applies to just about anybody who's listening to this, you will probably be aware of all sorts of places on the internet where a strip or a cartoon might actually work well, or whatever kind of writing you're doing. But let it, as my brother and I found this year, let it come from the heart. Let it tap into whatever you had when you were a child before school knocked it out of you. When you were sitting on your granny's lap with a pencil and a piece of paper, you knew you could draw the universe. Well, you can. You are unique. Find your own voice. Find your own style. But more than anything, do it for yourself. Enjoy what you're doing. The nicest tale I can think of, probably to end on, is that once upon a time on this planet, men and women were walking along, dragging their knuckles along the ground as cavemen and cave women. And then one day they suddenly picked themselves up off the ground and realized they wanted to communicate. And they figured a way of drawing on their cave walls with daub and wattle and whatever else. And the beauty is that what they created was comic strips. That's the first comic strip. And the real beauty is that those comic strips are still communicating with us today, thousands and thousands and thousands of years later. And we are being told stories by the cavemen, our ancestors, because they found this unique way of telling a tale. I love that. I love that thought that those were the early comic strips. So yeah.
I think that's really fantastic. That's a very wonderful observation that communication form has been around forever.
And the beauty of comics is that they are the perfect global communication form.
Sure.
Because you don't even need words. I mean, obviously words come first because the writer comes first.
Once you have the image, adding words in other languages is quite easy.
Well, exactly. Or indeed, you can create a strip without any words in there, but you still need the words to tell the artist what to draw. So, but then you take them all out and you have, the perfect global comic strip. I mean, a perfect global communication to the planet.
Well, Tim Quinn, this has been an absolutely spectacular, almost 105 minutes worth of show today. And so I am just thrilled to bits to have had a chance to pick your brain about all your career and the business and comics and all the rest of it. And I can't thank you enough for being my guest on StoryBeat today.
Well, I can't thank you enough, but I will thank you enough. Thank you. This is, I will say, I've been interviewed a zillion times, and this is by far the best interview I've had, without a doubt. So thank you so much for your time, patience, and indeed for reading the books, which is going several steps beyond most interviewers, I have to say, who will read the blurb on the back of the book and that be enough for them. So congratulations to you. It is a joy. I think we are similar-minded people here, and I think that, I hope, has come across tonight. All the very best to you and your listeners.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden. And may all your stories be unforgettable.